Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government correspondent, and today my guest is Representative Shannon Zimmerman. Shannon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation, Jamie. Always appreciate being here.
Yes, and you're here not necessarily to give us an update on the legislature, but rather it's political season. There's going to be an election in November.
Right.
Your opponent has had an opportunity to be interviewed by me, and we'll be replaying these interviews for the public to see. So, because somebody actually might be watching this show that hasn't seen your prior interviews with me, so why don't you give a little bit about your background, who you are, where you live, and what you did prior to getting in the legislature.
Sure, absolutely. So, I'm a lifelong Wisconsin resident. Grew up in Western Wisconsin, a little bit more towards the Eau Claire area. Never been shy or embarrassed about the fact I kind of come from very humble, I call it poor beginnings. Family did all we could. Moved to this area, to River Falls specifically, in 1996. Have lived here since then. Raised both of my boys in River Falls. Coached football. Been active in the community. My wife and I founded a company the year after moving here, and that was a blessed journey. We hired a ton of great local talent, people that I still run into at the grocery store on a regular basis. So we, at our peak, had roughly 300 employees locally. We were a St. Croix County Business of the Year. That company grew internationally. Ultimately, it became the decision of my wife and I and the board that it was appropriate to sell based on the industry we were in. And so we did that, but I've started part of a new startup now, another tech business in the area, and hired back.
Not competing with the old one, are you?
No. It's kind of exciting because it's the next generation. It's artificial intelligence using, and so I love it, but slowly kind of bringing some of the old team members back, and it's just a blessed journey, and I'm grateful for this community in this area.
Well, I think we're going to be talking about some tech issues as we get into things that you are doing in the legislature. But so you then ran for state representative. You are finishing your third term, correct?
That's correct.
And you're seeking re-election to fourth term.
Yes.
So let's talk about what you've accomplished so far. What are some of the things that you're proud of?
Yep. So for me, number one, I try and bring a very common sense approach to all things in the legislature. Prior to running for office in 2016, had you asked me, hey, do you have any interest in running for public office? I would have said, no, absolutely not. Why would you do that to yourself? And then ultimately, I came to the decision because I was experiencing frustrations as a business owner that I'm sure other business owners were experiencing. I felt like in some ways, Madison was out of touch from what was happening here in Western Wisconsin. And as an employer here, I knew firsthand, I had a front row seat to the fact that we're the fastest growing part of the state right now. And that's not going to change, I don't believe, anytime soon. So it's imperative that our voice is heard. So, when I joined, I tried to bring that business philosophy. We've done some good things. In my second term, so being a freshman, you really are a freshman. You learn the ropes. You've got to understand, kind of how to get things done. In my second term, I was very fortunate to be appointed to the Joint Committee on Finance. To me, this is the best committee to be on. It is the committee that controls the state's purse strings, and the state goes as the checkbook goes, just like we do in our families. I'm a conservative. I'm a fiscal conservative, and it's important to me that government not get in the way of our businesses, not get in the way or be overburdensome on local families. So I have been, I'm proud of the fact that a range of budget-related bills, sending $3+ billion last session back to taxpayers in form of income tax was very important to me. Workforce issues, economic issues, but also issues that hit home here that are personal to people. Opiate drug addiction issues. We've passed a lot of bills that I believe will provide assistance and help to those fighting to get their lives on track. Support of law enforcement. Last cycle, bipartisan bill, fentanyl testing strips so that law enforcement, when they're encountering now someone maybe in distress, if that person, they have contact with fentanyl, that could potentially be lethal to the law enforcement officer. We don't want that. So let's provide these so that they can be safer as they're protecting our community. So, there's just an array of different bills, but I try and localize them every chance I get.
Okay. So that's what you've done. Now you're seeking a fourth term. Why? I know Dean Knutson, I think, was in the state legislature 6 years, and others before him, some were a little bit longer than that. But why are you seeking a fourth 2-year term?
Well, the 4-hour drive has me questioning it from time to time. But, you know, you get to a point where you feel like you really understand how to make a difference. In this last cycle, a teacher in River Falls was having a challenge with their business. I helped them. We passed legislation that resolved the problem for them. Local community issues in Hudson Waterfront, Mayor O'Connor reached out. He was having some challenges as a member of the Budget Committee and someone now who I think has been there long enough to know how to get things done. We delivered for our community. And I look at the current environment and the current state of things. And in some ways, you got to shake your head at the national news and some of the themes and the topics that we hear. And I love this state and I love this community. And not just, you know, my family, my adult sons and my 4 grandchildren, number 5 now is on the way, all live here. I'm not going to surrender and just let, for lack of a better label, maybe some of this woke philosophy or ideology take hold. We're going to be common sense. A government has a role, has a place. It's important. But I feel like I'm in a position now where I can truly and effectively really get things done for the great people of the St. Croix Valley. That's why I'm running again. That's why I'm asking people, you know, vote one more time.
Okay. So, well, let's look at the agenda that you have, because you've been there 6 years, things that you haven't been able to get accomplished yet that you'd want to in the next term are what?
Okay, so they kind of span the gamut here a little bit. First of all, the Wisconsin Data Privacy Act. That is a bill that I authored. I've spent my career in technology, and I love tech. Tech is going to, in my opinion, evolve to cure things like cancer. It's wonderful, right? We're excited for those innovations. But tech can also be used in nefarious ways. Your personal data, the data collected on your phone, on your television, on your smart device, whatever that may be, is being used by data collectors in ways that probably would actually be chilling to you. And so the Wisconsin Data Privacy Act is groundbreaking legislation that protects you. It gives you the power to say, wait a minute, hey, data collector, whomever that may be, what do you have on me? To whom have you shared or sold it? And 3, stop. It's really simple, right? I think this is actually legislation that can lead in the nation. It should be taken up at the federal level, Jamie. I would agree with those who say that, but I struggle to see the feds getting anything done these days. So I'm going to work for Wisconsin residents to get that through. I got it through the House. We got a successful vote on the floor of the House last session. I need to get it through the Senate now the next session, so that'll be a top priority. Everywhere I go in this community, I hear about workforce challenges, economic issues, in high inflation. Now, I realize we're one state of 50, and we can't solve all the nation's issues, but I'm going to work to make sure that the employers are treated in the state budget and with state legislation in a way that allows them the greatest opportunity for success. Because when the businesses are succeeding, so too are all our local residents, because that's the employment base for these people. I think there's a great opportunity to kind of reimagine the educational funding model. I know you're passionate about education. I think from K-12 to higher education, there's an opportunity here to do a better job. The lines of separation, I think, need to be grayed, because you've got some great kids coming out of Hudson High School or River Falls High School that are immediately employable in the trade and technical jobs. In fact, they have an associate degree. Let's not just make that kind of an exception. Let's make those sort of things the rule. And those are the things that I still want to get done before I'm done in the legislature.
Okay, well, other things that might come up in this next term, just based on some of the issues on the national level. One of the issues that has trickled down from being a national issue to now a state issue, and that is abortion, with the Dobbs decision, kind of overturning Roe v. Wade, which gave state legislators more of an out before, because it wouldn't be something that's coming up.
Right.
And right now, Wisconsin has this law that was passed in 1849. And so I guess the question would be, is this something that you foresee the legislature not touching with a 10-foot pole, or do you think that the 1849 law is going to be brought up to the 21st century?
So This subject is so emotional to people, and regardless of what side you're on, there's no real crystal clear answer, right? If you talk to someone who is pro-choice, and they say, hey, it's a woman's right to choose, it's her body. We all should have, obviously, say over our bodies, absolutely. But the reality is, we're also talking about another human being. And I've had this discussion locally with many people where they say, you know, I think at X weeks or Y weeks or Z weeks, that's when that shouldn't happen. But it all seems so arbitrary in some ways. So here's the reality. What the Supreme Court has done has now kicked it down to the states, all right? I look forward to having this discussion. I became a father at 17 years old. I know I've shared that with you in the past, scared out of my mind. And so I know what it's like in that moment where it wasn't planned, clearly, but you're faced with one of the most difficult and heavy decisions you possibly could face. My wife and I, she wasn't my wife at the time, but we would go on to get married in 32 years this year, and from that came 2 beautiful sons from that decision of life. I am pro-life. But if you ask me, do I understand the angst telling a husband that, hey, sorry, you're going to lose your wife and you don't have a say here? I get it. So I welcome this discussion, and I think it's going to come up. I don't think for a moment that this is going to be jumping one way hard, right or left or up or down, right? I think that this is going to result in thoughtful discussion, because if you think about the dynamics and complexity, yeah, there's a lot to cover here, and there'll be passion from both sides, from all sides. Let's talk about it. But you know, today it's used to villainize, and I got to tell you, locally, being candid, I don't hear it often. Since the Supreme Court decision, you just don't hear it often. When you go to doors and do what I do, you're knocking on doors, you're asking people, what's on your mind? The cost of gasoline, food, you know, all those sort of things are the number one thing that comes out of their mouth these days. So as far as that topic goes in the state of Wisconsin, okay, let's get into committee hearings, let's talk about it, let's hear from experts and people who are passionate on both sides of it, and let's determine if change is in fact required and what that should be.
When you say change is required, so the current law that was passed in 1849 has an exception for the life of the mother, and that's it.
That was the example I gave there, yeah. So under current Wisconsin law, that's exactly correct. There is an exemption for life of the mother. The other examples most commonly heard, of course, are generally fairly extreme and rare most often, but it could be rape or incest. Those sort of things I know will be points of discussion.
Would you be supportive of those exceptions?
I want to hear everybody out, but I tell you what, here's what I don't want. I think that people need to appreciate the fact that when a woman is pregnant, we have 2 human beings there. And in that moment, one has an audible voice and the other doesn't. And that is not lost on me. And what I don't want to see, I don't want to see abortion used as contraception. And I get the choice argument, and I respect that. And I'm certainly sympathetic to that. But let's not forget, there's another person that can't speak their voice. They probably, if they could, would love to take a position of choice and have their voice heard in that discussion. And that's why this subject is important to me.
Okay, so your position then for rape and incest is maybe that you might support it, or
I want to hear everybody out, because I've gone back and forth. You know, I originally had talked about the fact that, look, those are extreme situations and we should absolutely provide exceptions. As I have heard from people, there's a lot of discussion around a robust adoption organizations across not only the state, but the nation for that matter. And so, you know, even locally, I know some folks, they visit our winery, have been involved, and they worked so hard to adopt. There's an appetite, wonderful parents who are willing to take children and so forth. So I just feel like we can't dismiss that so quickly. Let's have all those people get in a room and talk in these committee hearings, and let's talk this through.
What about, like, because you were using the example of pregnant, so once there's a confirmed pregnancy and not, you generally would protect that life. But what about, and not use it as contraception, as you said, but what about Plan B contraception, which is, you know, as I understand it, after the the egg and the sperm have met, so to speak, but maybe before the embryo has implanted or anything. Would you be favor or not in favor of including Plan B within that?
I would want to understand more of the science, I guess, honestly, behind this, because this is what you're talking about is, when is a life a life?
Right.
Really, is it in that moment? Is it at week 4, 6, 10? It's my understanding that may be where a life is a life. I mean, again, I'm not a medical doctor.
Right.
But now that this has been sent back to the state, we're going to have a pretty robust conversation about it. So I don't really understand maybe per se the science behind, is that truly a life at that point? But I look forward to having that conversation.
Okay. Then the other point that some people brought up, and that would include Governor Michaels. I think in the primary he was trying to distinguish himself.
Governor Michaels, it is.
I know he's run for various offices,
Yeah.
but he's running for governor.
Yep.
And he had Rebecca Clayfish as one of his opponents, trying to set himself apart from her, and he was saying that he would be pushing, if elected, pushing for decertification. Is that something that you would go along with Michaels if he's elected governor?
So my opinion, Tim Michaels is certainly inclined to have his opinion, and again, we respect that. Donald Trump won Wisconsin by a very slim margin, and Donald Trump lost Wisconsin by a very slim margin. But the 2020 election's over. And do I think, and I tell you what, there have been state organizations, the Legislative Audit Bureau, these are good people, they're doing good work. There has been investigations done, and there's so much misinformation out there. But here's how I distill it when I cook it all down. There are examples of activities that we need to clean up. No question. I don't care what side of the partisan spectrum you're on, they need to be cleaned up, right? Democracy in the park and ballot harvesting, things of that nature. People, the opposition to election integrity bills saying we're making election or voting more difficult. Not at all. Voting should be incredibly easy to do and very difficult to cheat, and I do believe that. To answer your question about, would I support decertification? No, I will not support decertification. I did not see enough evidence to suggest that the election was wrong. I think there's things that need to be fixed. And just so everybody knows, we sent a ton of bills to the governor's office for him to sign. It meant to do all that, and they were all vetoed. And regardless of who's in the executive branch, I suspect we're going to send them again. We're not going to stop, because whether you're Democrat or Republican, we must have faith in elections. And people have to take stock in this. There's a large segment of our community that is skeptical. They can't be skeptical. We have to resolve that aspect. So that's my position on that topic.
Okay, getting into some of the other typical stuff when it comes to the state, because sometimes federal grants come in form of block grants.
Yep.
That's how the COVID money came into the state of Wisconsin, and there's been some disagreements between the governor and the legislature as to where that ought to be spent.
Yep.
What would be your position on that?
Well, as it currently stands, let me back up one step. I think one day we will all pause and reflect and look back on this period, and there'll be things that we say we did well, and there'll be things that we look back on and say we didn't do that so well. But it was a crazy time. For me specifically, one of the things, as just someone who I think has a basic understanding of economics, from 1990 until 2020, we've gone from $5 trillion to in excess of $30 trillion in national debt. Folks, that is unsustainable. You can't keep putting money on your grandchildren's credit card, because let's face it, we're not going to live long enough to see that paid back. It's real money, and at some point, people call for it and they want to get paid back. So that's why I believe fiscal responsibility is so important. Now to your question about the ARPA funds, the CARES Act, those sort of things. In the state of Wisconsin, and this was true of a number of other states, the governor has tremendous authority over the spending of that money. And the legislature, the Joint Committee on Finance, had a very small, literally a really small subset of those funds. But when I look at the monies, I have to just say this. Look, Let's invest that money strategically in things that will generate return for those generations down the road. They're going to be paying it back. For example, one of the things that I felt was a wise use of this, and COVID only exacerbated the need for this, but let's go to gigabyte service level broadband statewide. Urban, rural, right. I don't care, let's do it. Schools, when children weren't there, they had to connect, and many of these kids couldn't do it. They would have to go maybe to their local library, or they were just out. They couldn't do this. Economically and from a business perspective, we are far more attractive as a state with a stronger infrastructure like that. Now, we increased funding. The legislature sent substantially more money. The governor put some more money in. But if you're going to spend this, generate the return. And that is one example of where you generate the return. Next, there's nobody in the state of Wisconsin that's going to spend their hard-earned money better than the person who earned it. So rather than create some other government agency or entity, because the people of Wisconsin are on the hook and we're going to be paying this back with our taxes, send it back to them. Use it strategically in other areas. Maybe, for example, we look at, I know you and I have talked about the educational system, infrastructure costs for schools. All this should be on the table. Maybe there's a balance between, hey, is there opportunity for some school consolidation, for efficiency and optimization? But oh, by the way, let's also make sure that those are modern facilities and they're equipped properly to handle those kids and maybe what could be situations like this. So I just feel like it's imperative that we put that money to use. I mean, it's done, right? The money's now in the bank in Wisconsin. Let's use it as wisely as we humanly can.
Well, I've heard that our rainy day fund is quote unquote maxed out. Is there any thought to looking at somehow enlarging that so that we reduce that roller coaster effect? So when the economy is going to contract, which it's bound to happen,
yeah,
and that flush green that we have coming in now won't be there.
Right.
Do you think it makes economic sense to have a bit more stable of a rainy day fund?
Yeah, so the rainy day fund for anybody watching is essentially like the state's equivalent of a savings account, right? It is exactly as labeled. It's a rainy day fund. Because
unlike the federal government, we don't run a deficit, because if we do, it has to come out of the rainy day fund.
Right. Exactly. So under Wisconsin Constitution, we have to have a balanced budget, one way or the other. The feds clearly haven't been able to do that, but hopefully one day they do. So the current rainy day fund rounding to, let's just say, roughly $2 billion, it's always a difficult question, because I don't think the state should be sitting on piles of your money, but there should be something there, because you're right. You don't need to be Nostradamus to know that all the borrowing we've done, which is driving up inflation, there's going to be a recessionary period, folks. It's unavoidable at this point in time.
And you mentioned a $2 billion rainy day fund, but what's our annual budget?
Annual budget, well, the biennium, last biennium was just over $80 billion. Okay, right. So to put that, I mean, that's a lot of money. So is $2 billion right or not? It probably feels about right. Maybe there's a small amount that could increase to, but not much more, because that is the money that should go back to. And just to be clear, Jamie, and I know you know this, the state's checkbook is far larger than that rainy day fund right now. And not a shocker, right? It's all, you can't put all those trillions of dollars into the national economy and not expect the states to be the recipients of some of that. Mm-hmm. There again, last cycle, over $3 billion that I voted for to send back to the residents of Wisconsin in the form of a collapse of one of the largest tax brackets in the state. Let's do it again. Let's look at broadband. Let's look at some of the educational pieces and those things that are strategic, because education is important to me for a lot of reasons, right? If we fail, there was this old line in my company. I was talking to my director of HR, and someone said at one point, well, why would we invest in training for employee X? What if they leave? And I love the line back. It was, well, what if we don't invest in educating them and they stay?
Yeah.
And I think that there's truth in that. We have a workforce shortage. Our technical colleges, our local high schools, and our universities are the feeder system here. So, I get there can be controversy over some of the things taught. No, stick to the things that matter, in my opinion, right? Stick to the things that help a young man or a young woman become employable, become a contributing member of their community. That is important to me. So education is just also one of those things for quality of life that keeps people in Wisconsin. Absolutely.
So,
Yes.
And it's also good business because it keeps an educated workforce as well.
Right. So a number of years ago, I was a part of a program. As an employer in River Falls, we had roughly 200 employees at the time, and we were desperate for more employees. We were advertising, doing all the normal things. Well, we were struggling, and so were some other businesses. So we got together with the city, the local schools, all levels, and we put together a program called Work River Falls. Now, I'm sure they've done it in a lot of other places, but the essence of it were 3 pillars that we knew had to be addressed. Employers and employees have to have a vibrant environment where education is a critical part of that, both for your kids, for those moving to the communities, but also for your workforce who needs to be retooled or have their skills sharpened a little bit. And you also need to have robust amenities within your community. Those 3 things all coexist and work together to create the vibrant St. Croix Valley that we have. So, we need every one of those to be thriving. We need our downtown businesses to be up and going strong, our schools, our employers, our employees. And employees, by the way, I think one of the best ways we want to recruit from across that river and bring them over here, keep reducing the tax rate. Human beings are predictable. When it's pleasurable for them or there's something in it for them, they'll do it. I've watched it my entire career. Let's create a financial incentive for people to come over here and take our jobs.
Well, what about, then the other one is infrastructure, because rather than being reliant on the federal government to be granting this and granting that,
Yep.
One way we can set ourselves apart from the neighboring states and other regions of the country is a good education system, but also good infrastructure.
Yep.
And we've been allowing the infrastructure in this state to deteriorate for probably 10 years. Mm-hmm. They stopped investing in. So when we're flush with cash, wouldn't it be good to start rebuilding our crumbling bridges and roads?
Well, you take a drive around Hudson these days, and it looks like over the past couple of years, we've certainly seen some investment in infrastructure. You get on I-94, and we're seeing a lot of that. I mean, the short answer is yes. We can't ignore those things. It's what your dentist would tell you, right? You can ignore that cavity, but sooner or later, you believe me, you're coming in. Right. And the same is true of our infrastructure and roads. And if you look at where we're located geographically, right? Major artery, state boundary, major artery through us, major rail system right here. These are things we've got to keep up because businesses will come because of those. And when businesses come, people are working, the schools are interacting with those businesses. That's how it should work. So the short answer, Jamie, is yes, we need to make sure that we're doing our part to make sure the infrastructure is adequate and not ignored.
And you mentioned, and I was referring to physical infrastructure, but you earlier alluded to the technological infrastructure with
absolutely
broadband and so forth.
Yeah.
So another area needing investment. Finally, public safety, and there's been calls to defund the police and so forth. People look right away to what's being spent on our prisons, but the more economic, efficient way of, addressing that issue is preventing it rather than following up after the fact. So what would you see as any specific program that you'd like to champion in the next 2 years?
So first of all, in my opinion, and very candidly and bluntly, this defund the police nonsense is just that. It's nonsense. It is no different. If there have been bad actors or examples of bad behavior, that's the individual that made that decision and should be held accountable for that. Law enforcement across the St. Croix Valley is exceptional. And I mentioned the fentanyl bill that got through to protect law enforcement. I have been a huge proponent of our local law enforcement and will continue to do so. And one of the reasons is, as I go through the community, as I said to you earlier, and a lot of people who used to go across that river and spend their money in Minneapolis, they don't go anymore. Which maybe is good for our local businesses, and I'm all about that, but they don't go anymore because it's unpredictable and it's scary and they're putting themselves at risk. We're not going to let that happen here in the St. Croix Valley or in the state of Wisconsin. So I do think that investments in law enforcement are key. You mentioned being proactive. Let's get in front of this before it's an issue. As the person now in the legislature who champions the HOPE agenda, heroin opiate prevention and education, I picked this up from former Representative John Nygren. I have said to you before, I have a personal family experience with this, and I can tell you, when you get involved in the system because you've had some substance abuse issues, it is so difficult to get out. It's so difficult to get a job afterwards, and if you can't get employment and you can't get housing, well, guess where you're going to end up again. And so I think going upstream, prevention, awareness, harm reduction, all of those things are investments that pay huge returns, because we're not incarcerating, we're not having people rob, steal, involved in criminal behavior. Those are things we can do that help our community. And I tell you what, in this community, you don't have to look far. No one's immune from these sort of challenges. Every family or neighbor knows somebody that's struggled. It's not the scarlet letter. People shouldn't think that it is. And I think that we can create a different structure where you're not criticized or ridiculed. We're going to help you on the front end. Now, you got to do the work. People who find themselves in these situations have to do the work. But if we can nip it sooner, they're not getting involved in law enforcement, and it's a better community overall.
Well, I see we're getting down on our time. So is there any issue that we haven't touched upon that you would like to point out as something that you're in support of? I tell you what, elections are a funny thing, and we live in such a polarized environment these days. I just literally shake my head. But I'm going to say this to the voters of the St. Croix Valley one more time. There are two kinds of people. I think there are talkers and there are doers. And there's those people that feel that all of social media is waiting with bated breath to hear what I have to say on a certain subject or what someone has to say. Not me, never going to be me. I'd rather be viewed as the guy who solved problems for my community, and that's why I'm asking for the support of this community one more time. Because whether it's education, whether it's a university science tech building in River Falls, or it's the waterfront in Hudson, I know that local leaders know they can rely on me to be their voice in Madison and get things done. How can people reach you if they want to find out more about you? ShannonZimmerman.com, and I welcome them to do that. Okay, pretty straightforward, ShannonZimmerman.com. Thanks a lot for being on the show again. Thank you. And I want to thank our viewers for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, and keep watching.